No, I'm not making a problem out of a personal question. I make of a personal question an absence of a problem. Let me take a very simple example, which I will not analyze, but which is this: how was it possible that men began, at the end of the 18th century, for the first time in the history of Western thought, and of Western knowledge, to open up the corpses of people, in order to know what was the source, the origin, the anatomical needle, of the particular malady which was responsible for their deaths? The idea seems simple enough. Well, 4 or 5,000 years of medicine in the West were needed before we had the idea of looking for the cause of the malady in the lesion of a corpse. If you tried to explain this by the personality of Bitchet, I believe that would be without interest. If, on the contrary, you tried to establish the place of disease and of death in society at the end of the 18th century, and what interest industrial society effectively had in quadrupling the entire population, in order to expand and develop itself, as a result of which medical surveys of society were made, big hospitals were opened, etc., if you tried to find out how medical knowledge became institutionalized in that period, how its relations with other kinds of knowledge were ordered, well, then you could see how the relationship between disease, the hospitalized, ill person, the corpse, and pathological anatomy were made possible. Here is, I believe, a form of analysis, which I don't say is new, but which in any case, has been much too neglected, and personal events have almost nothing to do with it.
I would like to depart from your injunction very briefly, just to make one comment about what Mr. Foucault just said. I think that illustrates very nicely the way in which we are digging into the mountain from opposite directions, to use your original image. That is, I think that an act of scientific creation depends on two facts: one, some intrinsic property of the mind; another, some set of social and intellectual conditions that exist. And it is not a question, as I see it, of which of these we should study, rather we will understand scientific discovery, and similarly any other kind of discovery, when we know what these factors are, and can therefore explain how they interact in a particular fashion. My particular interest, in this connection at least, is with the intrinsic capacities of the mind. Yours, as you say, is in the particular arrangement of social and economic and other conditions.
But I don't believe that difference is connected to our characters, because at this moment it would make Mr. Elders right, and he must not be right.
No, I agree, and
it's connected to the state of knowledge, of knowing, in which we are working. The linguistics with which you have been familiar, and which you have succeeded in transforming, excluded the importance of the creative subject, of the creative speaking subject, while the history of science such as it existed when people of my generation were starting to work, on the contrary, exalted individual creativity.
Yes.
And put aside these collective rules.
Yes. Well, I think that as a matter of biological and anthropological fact, the nature of human intelligence certainly has not changed in any substantial way, at least since the 17th century, or probably since Cro-Magnon man. That is, I think that the fundamental properties of our intelligence, those that are within the domain of what we are discussing tonight, are certainly very ancient, and that if you took a man from 5,000 or maybe 20,000 years ago, and placed him as a child within today's society, he would learn what everyone else learns, and he would be a genius or a fool or something else, but he wouldn't be fundamentally different. But, of course, the level of acquired knowledge changes, social conditions change those conditions that permit a person to think freely, and break through the bonds of, let's say, superstitious constraint. And as those conditions change, a given human intelligence will progress to new forms of creation. In fact, this relates very closely to the last question that Mr. Elders put, if I can perhaps say a word about that. Take behavioral science, and think of it in these contexts. It seems to me that the fundamental property of behaviorism, which is in a way suggested by the odd term behavioral science, is that it is a negation of the possibility of developing a scientific theory. That is, what defines behaviorism is the very curious and self-destructive assumption that you are not permitted to create an interesting theory. If physics, for example, had made the assumption that you have to keep the phenomena and their arrangement and such things, we would be doing Babylonian astronomy today. Fortunately, physicists never made this ridiculous extraneous assumption, which has its own historical reasons, and had to do with all sorts of curious facts about the historical context in which behaviorism evolved. But looking at it purely intellectually, behaviorism is the arbitrary insistence that one must not create a scientific theory of human behavior. Rather, one must deal directly with phenomena and their interrelation, and no more something which is totally impossible in any other domain, and I assume impossible in the domain of human intelligence or human behavior as well. So in this sense, I don't think that behaviorism is a science. Here is a case in point of just the kind of thing that you mentioned, and that Mr. Foucault is discussing, under certain historical circumstances, for example those in which experimental psychology developed. It was for some reason which I won't go into interesting and may be important to impose some very strange limitations on the kind of scientific theory construction that was permitted, and those very strange limitations are known as behaviorism. Well, it has long since run its course, I think. Whatever value it may have had in 1880, it has no function today, except constraining and limiting scientific inquiry, and should therefore simply be dispensed with, in the same way one would dispense with a physicist who said, "You're not allowed to develop a general physical theory, you're only allowed to plot the motions of the planets, and make up more epicycles," and so on and so forth. One forgets about that, and puts it aside. Similarly, one should put aside the very curious restrictions that define behaviorism, restrictions which are, as I said before, very much suggested by the term behavioral science itself. We can agree, perhaps, that behavior in some broad sense constitutes the data for the science of man. But to define a science by its data would be to define physics as the theory of meter readings. And if a physicist were to say, "Yes, I'm involved in meter reading science," we could be pretty sure that he was not going to get very far. They might talk about meter readings and correlations between them and such things, but they wouldn't ever create physical theory. And so the term itself is symptomatic of the disease in this case. We should understand the historical context in which these curious limitations developed, and having understood them, I believe, discard them and proceed in the science of men as we would in any other domain, that is by discarding entirely behaviorism and in fact, in my view, the entire empiricist tradition from which it evolved.